All right, so let's start off. We've got 10 minutes for opening statements. And the first opening statement will be from the supporting side for the proposition that nuclear energy is a necessary and sufficiently safe component of America's energy future. So we'll have 10 minutes for each opening statement, and then we'll get to questions from the audience. So go ahead, Mike.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks for coming. Obviously, it's a very hot button issue. A lot of people are very interested in this issue. So it's very good we've had these various presentations beforehand. And I'm very happy that, as Stephanie said, it's not a yes-no issue, this. It's not, are you for nukes or against nukes? And when I say nukes, I mean nuclear power stations, not nuclear weapons. It's not just yes-no. There are many aspects to this discussion, many dimensions. So actually, I see a bumper sticker, no nukes, and that rather annoys me, because for one thing, psychologically, people associate that with nuclear weapons, at least I do. And secondly, it's too black and white an issue. Happily, the motion today that nuclear power is a necessary and sufficient component of our energy resources in the US is the motion we're talking about. So, two of the greatest problems facing humanity today are global climate change, human-induced global climate change, and population growth, especially population growth in third world countries or countries like China and India and so on, where the standard of living is very low. And naturally, the people in these countries want and expect an improved standard of living. You see the growth of automobiles in China, for example, the growth of appliances using electricity, probably the growth of air conditioning, and so on and so forth. So the use per capita of energy in the US is relatively constant. Basically, we satisfy our needs, but we can't drive two cars at the same time. However, the energy used per capita in the US is more than twice what it is in countries in Europe. And I've taken an average of Germany, France, Italy, and the UK. I've lived in these countries, and I know that the standard of living or the quality of life is essentially equivalent to what it is in the US. So why do we need to spend twice as much, use twice as much energy sources as in these countries? Now, global change is indeed global. What happens in China affects us all. But we cannot tell China what to do, while we ourselves are the great polluters per capita. We use twice as much as they do. So it's very important for us, even though America is, the US, is not the greatest growth in energy use, to change our ways. What are the factors here? I mean, in the US, for example, gasoline is very cheap. Actually, it's 3 times more in the UK. People rely more on public transport, they're more careful about use, they don't have so much air conditioning. We could all turn our air conditioning down by the temperature, let it be a degree or two warmer, and that would already save quite a lot. Reducing our consumption of energy in the US is a good part of the equation, but globally it will not counteract the increased usage elsewhere. It's one of 4 necessary things that we have to do to basically try to preserve the planet. We're not going to reverse climate change in the foreseeable future, but we can slow it down and we can do our bit. Could I have the first slide, please? Oh, it's already up there. Okay, so that's our motion. So I'll just put that up there. So there are a fourfold attack that we have to do on this climate change issue. Reduction of usage of energy. We can all do our bit to that. If you put a solar power panel on your roof, if you want to do that, that's fine. It may be subsidized by taxpayers, and because it's quite expensive to do actually. But you may feel good because you're now actually taking more power out of the wall plug. Reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuels, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, methane, and so on. These are all contributing to the increase in global climate change. Increased renewables, meaning renewable, it means that you're not using up fuel. That's solar energy, solar wind, water, geothermal, and so on. These are always going to be there. Although when I think about water, always going to be there, actually we're seeing now increased droughts in places like California and Australia. They may not be able to count on hydroelectric power as much in the future, simply because of increased droughts with global climate change and so on. So not necessarily always there for us in the levels we want. And then nuclear energy, which I claim is as safe and clean as the renewables that you talk about, and much cleaner than coal and gas. So let's not think like most politicians do about the timescale of the next election. Let's think about the timescale of our children, our grandchildren, and our future. I mean, after all, we would like the human race to persist not for a few hundred years, but for a few thousand years, more and more. So don't expect more scientific miracles to come along and save the day, like nuclear fusion, for example. People think, oh, the scientists are developing nuclear fusion. This is the power what powers the sun. This is going to save us. It is not, because actually, to date, no nuclear fusion experiment could produce power for more than about a day without the materials crumbling from the intense neutron flux of radiation. And people think that this is the power of the sun we're bringing to the Earth. But no, it's not. Actually, an amazing to everybody fact is that if you take a cubic meter at the center of the sun, the net power output is about 100 watts. 100 watts from a cubic meter. So 20 million degrees, right? Of course, it would cool down pretty quickly, but there's just so much sun that it gives so much energy out because it's so vast compared with the Earth. So maybe it's not impossible that we will develop new forms of power which can than we know of today, but don't count on it. Don't count on it. So why do I say that nuclear is as clean and safe as above? Maybe these slides aren't in order. Oh, this one is showing the energy used per capita in different countries, kilograms of oil equivalent. This is data from the World Bank in 2011. And you see, here's the US, and these are the other the European countries that have a high standard of living here. And it's about a factor of 2 of the average of these. And quality of life not so different, as I said. Many factors which we can reduce. Now, this is the world energy consumption in 1,000 terawatt hours per year. Okay. And you see here, this is oil. And you see how that's been growing, and it's still growing fast, especially in coal. Coal is worse, even worse, I think, because of the pollution it causes. You know, in China, people go around with masks against the smog, and so China is saying we have to stop building these coal plants, and in fact we have to replace them with nuclear plants. This is worldwide. This is hydroelectric power. As I say, it's been rising, but don't expect it to rise forever. Nuclear is small on the world scale. It's larger in some countries. And this is what we call green, other renewables. That's wind, solar power. This is very small. Wind is about half of this. So even if you increase the wind, the power from wind, which we are doing by about 17, 18, 20% a year, it's not going to jump up high. It's going to continue to increase, but it's not going to overtake even the growth needs of the world.
2 minutes.
Oh gosh, okay, all right. So one thing, it's impossible for a nuclear reactor to explode like a bomb. It's just as impossible as for a match to explode like dynamite. I mean, it's just not physically the case. And reactors do not, Bob can talk more about in the discussion about safety issues, but they do not emit radiation outside their walls. I would much rather live next to a nuclear power station than a coal power station. It's much cleaner. And there have been accidents which people think about. Oh my God, think Chernobyl, think about 3 Mile Island, think about Fukushima. Now, Chernobyl was by far the worst. Soviet era was it wasn't about safety, it was about productivity. And I've learned a lot about the Chernobyl reactor and how bad that was. People were on their balconies next to the reactor looking at it for days before they were told to evacuate. 3 Mile Island was a sort of a good example of how a reactor can have a core meltdown and not blow up and not emit radiation. There was a little bit of radiation emitted, but not much more than the background radiation that we all live in all the time. And then Fukushima. Okay, so this was really bad, but about 19,000 people got killed by the tsunami and the earthquake, not by the reactors. In fact, nobody's death can be, no civilian's death can be accounted for by the accident. There were some deaths among the workers and the people who are cleaning it up, but deaths happen all the time in coal coal mines and so on and so forth. So in fact, of those three major incidents, only the Chernobyl one, and nobody would build a reactor like that anymore. That was a very bad design, it was Soviet and so on and so forth. And we can be sure that reactors in future will be better regulated than that. So there's one other thing I would say is that there are developments, for example, India and China are both working on a new type of reactor that is subcritical. That means you switch it off with the wall plug and it stands down. It can't go critical. And at the same time, it burns up nuclear waste. It's called accelerated driven systems. The US is not working on this. Why? Because we've got so much uranium and it's so cheap, it's not economical for us to even spend money on that research.
All right, time.
Should be. Okay. All right. So I just will. This is France fire. This is France fire. France. Yellow is nuclear. No issues. So there, I'm convinced that this is the case, and I pass the buck to my colleague here.
All right, thank you very much. All right, David.
All right, we're going to queue up a different slideshow. Let's see if we can do that.
Dave, would you introduce yourself?
I will. Here we go. Thank you. My name is Dave Kraft. I'm Director of Nuclear Energy Information Service. We're based in Chicago. We were formed in 1981 to watchdog the nuclear industry here in Illinois, but also to promote a different kind of energy future based on renewables and energy efficiency. So it's a two-pronged approach. You know, we're not just against something, we're very much in favor of something. And I was pleased when we first met 2 months ago to hear much of what we said was very much in parallel. And honestly, the first 3 points that Michael put up today, we're in total agreement on. And this is not the first time this has happened. I've been on panels with Bob Rosner in the past, who's a former director of Argonne, and it's the same thing. We are both in agreement that renewables, efficiency, have to take place in the future. So there's a lot of agreement, and it's just that fourth point that went up there I think that we're going to be disagreeing on. So 10 minutes goes fast. I'll have to jam a lot of ideas in the first part, and then we'll get into it in the question and answer. So the first thing is I'm going to risk violating the rules of the debate from the get-go, because the question itself, proposition, nuclear energy is a necessary and sufficiently safe component of America's energy future, bears some examination. The problem is, what is America's energy future, number one? How do you define necessary in terms of its present use? And sufficiently safe is also kind of spongy and open to interpretation. So the problem is that we'll get to some general idea of what direction we want to head, but it's worth further examining and being a little bit more precise about each of those 3 points in your proposition. So when I was here 2 months ago after the movie, I introduced this concept of there are two kinds of nuclear power. There is nuclear power, what we call the platonic form, and then there's nuclear power, the reality. Platonic form, if you remember Plato, way back when, is the idea of a universal, perfect example of something. It's the abstract, it's the model on which everything is based. And nuclear, whenever we come out and do these presentations, we hear a lot about this, And if you watch Commonwealth Edison or Exelon's advertising, safe, clean, green, that's nuclear in its platonic form. And as Einstein once said, theory and practice are the same in theory, but they're not in practice. And that's where the rub comes in with nuclear. That's the reality, because although we can talk about building better boxes, to contain 1,000 Hiroshimas, that's not going to help you if the regulators decide not to regulate, or if they're corrupt, or if people introduce parts that are counterfeit, or that governments decide to build nuclear reactors in war zones like the Ukraine, and on and on and on. That is nuclear power also. The other thing we didn't touch on this morning, though, is the pretty box, off of I-55 or out by the Rock River, or up, it's being torn down now on the lakeshore by Zion, is not nuclear power. Those are just the reactors. In order to get to that pretty box, you have to have 150 million tons of uranium mill tailings on 51 sites blowing around the Southwest. You also have to endure the worst radiological accident on the North American continent, which was not 3 Mile Island. It was a dam break at a mill tailings pond in the Southwest at the Rio Puerco River just a few months before 3 Mile Island in 1979. What I'm driving at here is nuclear power is bigger than just the pretty box and the theoretical constructs. There's a real messy world out there that's attached to it, and you have to examine that and take the whole enchilada. You can't just pick and choose. So that's what we're driving at with this notion here. You know, who wouldn't want, you know, safe, clean nuclear power? Everyone, you know, but it just doesn't match the real world. Now, when I started the group, we only had 4 deadly sins of nuclear, and we've since expanded them to 7, and I'll rattle them off real quick, because we got to move on here. As has been pointed out, there's always the threat of the catastrophic accident, but even not necessarily the catastrophic ones. You can have minor ones or smaller incidents which can have radiological impacts, like the Tokai Mori accident that occurred in Japan. Not at a nuclear power plant, but very significant for the people in that local area. I can send you the slide, you don't have to take notes. Second, the radioactive waste issue. You know, we always think there's an away somewhere. Well, there isn't, you know. This is a self-contained system on this planet. We have radioactive waste, we are generating radioactive waste. We do not have a place to put it, yet we keep generating it. You know, that's kind of weird. Third thing is the enormous expense involved with nuclear, especially new nuclear as opposed to what we already have in place, which is not the greatest form of nuclear, and I think we would even have some agreement on that from our Argonne colleagues. The Generation 3, Generation 4 reactors, so far from what we've seen on the planet, are incredibly expensive in terms of the Generation 3 type. They're way over budget, way behind schedule. And we haven't even gotten to Generation 4, which are the type of reactors which would supposedly consume the radioactive waste. There is a very good TED presentation by Bill Gates on this topic, by the way, and I would urge you to seek it out. He talks about energy miracles, and I'm glad you brought that up, Mike. There aren't going to be miracles, but Mr. Gates believes there is, and he's latching onto a project called the Traveling Wave Reactor. But when you scratch below the surface of these wonderful propositions or remarks, you find out that you're not going to get a traveling wave reactor in quantities big enough to deal with climate disruption, for the next 40 years or so. Game over. The numbers just don't compute. Energy irrelevancy. And here's, again, a point of agreement between my colleagues here at Argonne and us. We waste much more energy than we need to, than we have to. In fact, studies done by the Electric Power Research Institute, the Department of Energy Laboratories, over the years have consistently come up with a figure that we waste somewhere between 20% and 44% of all the electrons we generate. All of nuclear power plants in the United States only give us 19% of our electricity.
2 minutes.
What?
2 minutes.
Oh, it scared me. So that's what we mean by it's irrelevant. The other 3 have just been byproducts of the last 30 years of operation. You hear that nuclear can reduce foreign dependency on foreign oil. I don't know any of you who came here in your nuclear power cars today. Second piece, fighting global warming effectively, not at all. Nuclear power plants take much too long to build. They are far too expensive. They are not in the development stage yet where we can actually implement them quickly enough to do enough reversal on global warming meaningfully. And I have a paper back there. Just the other day, there was an announcement by the Tesla Corporation of a revolutionary new battery for storage, which is going to help solve the intermittency problem of renewables. The point of it, though, is that that's technology we have now. This is stuff we can do now. We don't have to wait 40 years and spend $50 trillion approximately to build enough reactors to do anything meaningful on climate change. And there's a real delicious quote from one of the presenters the other day at Northwestern University, Arnie Gunderson, which I would like to read if I could find it real quick. On the issue of intermittency and can we do renewables in a size enough, this is what he says. says, we all know that the wind doesn't blow consistently and the sun doesn't shine every day, but the nuclear industry would have you believe that humankind is smart enough to develop techniques to store nuclear waste for 250,000 years, but at the same time, humankind is so dumb, we can't figure out a way to store electricity overnight. To me, that doesn't make sense. And I would also put a plug in for Argonne, because one of the major research arms that they're doing right now is on battery storage, is on utility scale, scaling up of storage techniques, which will make renewables more viable than they are now. And they are already viable, because 30% of the electricity of Denmark comes from renewables, over into 20% for Germany. United States, it's minuscule, but it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's because nuclear and coal have been in the way and have subverted and prevented renewable energy from taking its logical place in our energy mix. And I think I'm at time, aren't I?
Yep. Thank you very much. Thank
Now
you.
for your questions. Why don't we all come on front?
Or we can come up front. I just want to make sure that people can distinguish between the pro side and the...
I'm the ball one.
They focus their eyes on the make a statement.
Sure.
I didn't introduce myself.
All right, yeah, go ahead.
I should have. I'm Mike Albright. I'm a Fermilab. I'm a plant physicist. I don't have anything to do professionally with nuclear power. It's obviously an interesting thing for me. I'm not Argonne, I'm Fermilab, and this is something I feel passionate about, but it's nothing to do with my job or anything like that. That we use nuclear power in our life of war, actually.
I should probably introduce myself.
Yeah, Bob introduce himself.
I'm Bob Wunderlich. Actually, I have a master's.
Microphone, please.
Oh, sorry. I'm Bob Wunderlich. I worked for the Department of Energy for over 35 years. Been involved, actually was an expert in waste management during the 1980s and was part of the site investigations for the Salt Repository Project in Deaf Smith County in Texas. Really haven't worked much. Actually started in the Atomic Energy Commission and reactor safety. Haven't really worked that much in the last 25 years except for accelerators. So I do have some experience, and it might be a bit dated, but helping Mike because he didn't have safety or waste management issues.
All right, so we'd like to open it to questions from the audience. You can indicate when you ask your question which side you are asking your question of, and then the other side will get an opportunity to rebut. So let's start with the lady who stood up, Carol.
Are we doing a microphone or no?
Yeah, if you speak close to the camera, it will pick up your, but if you speak just normally, raise your voice a little bit, it should pick up your voice.
go to the podium and answer to
Sure.
My question is for both sides. I haven't heard water be discussed so far in the presentations. I'd like comments on the impact on water from both sides.
All right, so pro side, you want to talk about water for a moment?
Do you mean hydroelectric power, or do you mean something else?
Well, that could be part of it, but I was thinking more in terms of a growing water scarcity of potable water and aquifers and pollution to our water supply.
A quick response. First, hydroelectric power is a much bigger part of our energy supply than solar and wind at the moment, and it's growing by about 18% a year or so. But it's a few percent, and it's going to take decades for that to become anything close approaching the energy we get from coal. About clean water, which is obviously a major issue in many places around the world, and there's plenty of water on Earth, but it's salty. And with power, you can desalinate it and produce clean power. So in principle, nuclear power stations or other clean energy sources can help in desalinating water and producing clean water. I don't know if that's my gut reaction about that. You were not referring to water contamination from nuclear power stations, were you?
That's
No,
one of it.
I don't think that, well, Bob may answer better on that. I think the water that comes out of most power stations do use water for cooling, but it's closed cycles. So the water that's used for cooling is in pipes. It does not get out into the environment. You see cooling towers at most power stations with clouds of steam coming out. And when we had that movie in Just Fuse the other week, this was continually, they were showing these cooling towers with clouds of steam, and they didn't say so, but the implication was, look at all this stuff that's coming out of these reactors. In fact, they were probably coal power stations, but that steam, water vapor rather, and it's not radioactive at all, because they don't use in open circuit water that's in contact with the radioactive.
Well, that is probably the best question to ask in terms of a climate-disrupted global warming world, because water is the resource. I mean, whether there's climate disruption or not. Now, I would point out that in Illinois, roughly 80% of the surface water used in the state is used for power plant electricity production. Now, that doesn't mean it's consumed. It means it's used, it's cycled through. But consider that. We're an agricultural state, and yet we utilize 80% of our surface fresh water for electricity production, because we have relied on this, what's called the steam cycle, where you boil water, create steam, drive the turbine, attach to a generator, it gives us electrons. That's old school when you compare it to getting electrons directly from solar or transferring energy from the wind, where you don't use water at all. Now, in terms of water use, nuclear power plants actually do use more water than even fossil fuel plants, even though fossil fuel plants are about 5% more productive than nuclear plants are in terms of electricity. But the problems that come up in a climate-disrupted world with nuclear, number one, is that you can't always, for years, the nuclear folks have been saying to us, well, what are you going to do when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow? Ha, ha, ha. Well, we have now, in the last decade or so, experienced situations where we have to say back to the nuclear people, and what are you going to do when the rivers don't flow? Because what has already happened, both in Illinois in 1988, where we lost 100 reactor days of operation because the plants were thermally polluting the rivers, or there wasn't enough water in the rivers to actually keep the plants safe. In Europe, in the early part of the last decade, they had several severe droughts where governments were forced with the decision to either close nuclear plants down completely or exceed design specifications and the regulations for dumping heat into the rivers. In other words, you will kill the river. That's your choice. Kill the river, keep the plants running, or shut the plants down. This can only increase in a climate-disrupted world where water becomes the premium resource. And if you believe the predictions, we're supposed to have the climate of West Texas by mid-century. So take a look at what's down in West Texas, and you might see what's going to happen toward the Illinois River network. And by the way, with the exception of the Byron Nuke, as you know, none of the plants here in Illinois use the cooling tower system, at least not the big ones. They have smaller ones. And so our rivers will be impacted, and the impacts of power plant in the case of nuclear are, number one, you have excessive thermal discharge locally because there's not enough volume or flow rate of the river to dilute it. You know, the old saying, the solution to pollution is dilution. Not anymore. If you don't have enough water to dilute the heat or disseminate that in the system, it stays locally and it kills the local biosystem. The same is for the allowable releases of radiation into water systems, because nuclear plants are allowed to release radionuclides below regulatory levels into rivers. But again, if you don't have enough volume, if you don't have enough push, that stuff stays locally and it bioconcentrates both in the plants, in the bottom sediments, and in the various organisms that feed up the food chain. So those are the problems that you have with nuclear.
You guys want to rebut anything?
Oh, and one last thing. We do have a paper called "It's the Water Stupid" on our website, so I encourage you to come to the website. We'll get you a copy.
We mentioned a couple of things here, so I think they're fair game. One is, yes, radiation is dangerous. Radiation needs to be controlled. You have a system in place where that occurs. We have the Great Lakes here, so we do have quite a bit of water. So we don't have the same level of concerns as they have. But we talked a minute ago about what if the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow. And that's a real problem. And He mentioned an article, because I read the same article on the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, that says it's a very limited use, and the price would be $3,500 per battery. So once you want to try to replace nuclear power with something, you really have to look at what's out there. What kinds of systems are in place? I've scoured the internet. I've looked at all kinds of sites trying to find one single credible plan. I stopped that. I looked for one single plan that showed that you could basically take the renewables and replace nuclear power with those. It does not exist. You have a gigawatt of electricity coming in Illinois. Essentially, how many batteries would you need? What's the resource level associated with that? What are the contamination levels associated with the production of hydrogen for those batteries? Those all need to be looked at. Those need to be planned. Right now, we do have nuclear power in place in the United States. There's as many as 5 plants being built in the United States. Watts Bar down in Tennessee is one that's starting up. Those are the kinds of things that really need to be looked at relative to what are you going to replace this with? What's really out there? What's real? What are the impacts with these other sorts of things? And there are problems. There is no perfect source out there. There's water problems. There will be dry lakes someplace. Maybe there's not enough. That plant will have to be shut down. Maybe go to closed loop cycles, which essentially would, in essence, use less water. Desalinization, they're doing that over in the Saudi Arabia in the areas down around there. So there are uses, but there is no perfect source of power. There is nothing out there. That's the reality versus the theory. You're going to have impacts. You're going to have things that aren't nice, no matter what source you have. Right now, because they're building more plants, what you need is an open process. If you look at the Tennessee Valley Authority, they actually have a plan, because they're the ones building some of these. They actually have a very open process where they have a long-term plan, and then they do environmental impact statements. They get a lot of public input on that. And that's the process you need to sort through all of these energy sources, none of which are as great as you'd like them to be. So you really need to have a much more open process, and you need to be realistic in terms of what are the impacts of the things that you're proposing, whether it's water impacts, radiation. Not every individual gets to sort through this. You have the federal government and the state government sorting through what the allowable regulations are in terms of impacts to people. But there aren't any perfect ones. Those of you who came in electric cars today, you got nuclear power to produce that. So there isn't any non-connected system here. So,
All right.
Sorry.
It's okay. Let's take another question. Let's take someone from this side of the room. Yeah, start.
So this question is for both sides. Naomi Klein recently wrote a book called This Changes Everything. And in it she cites a 2009 study by Mark Jacobson and Mark DeLucci. And this is kind of unfair, you're not going to lose that. But there is a study. There was a comment made, looking for studies, couldn't find anything. So here's a study for maybe later reference, in which 100% of the world's energy is claimed for all purposes could be supplied by wind, water, and solar resources as early as 2030. So, have any of you heard of this study?
No, but I don't believe it either. It's probably a very short article on what it is. You need to really look at the overall impacts of any replacement system.
So you're not familiar with it?
No.
Okay.
Well, I'm actually not familiar with the details of that study, but I'm actually surprised that you couldn't find anything, because the cover story of the January 2010 Scientific American covered just solar and how great an impact that could have in terms of displacing other energy resources. So I don't know if you read Scientific American or not, but beyond that, a colleague of mine named Arjun Makhijani wrote an entire book on the subject, came out in 2006, 2007, called Carbon-Free, Nuclear-Free, A Roadmap for U.S. Energy Policy. It's about 200 and some pages long. And he was challenged by someone with this very question, can we really have an energy future without nuclear power? And his original assessment was no. And it took a year of badgering by someone who said, look, I will give you the money, do the research. And he did the research, and then he wrote the book. And he came to the conclusion that we can get off of both fossil fuels and nuclear by the year 2050. 3 years later, though, he had to come back and confess that he was wrong. We can do it by 2040, and we can do it cost effectively. So there is plenty of material out there for anyone who really wants to look that would make the case that we can do this in a methodical, planned way. And I want to be clear, because I said this 2 months ago when I was here. I'm not here to champion solar America or wind America. You know, that's not the point for me. I think the very first point you had up there today was the one that we got to have a whole conference about, and that is, what do we use all this energy for? If we're waste sake, that yes, there is no perfect energy system or resource. That doesn't mean we don't have the obligation to prioritize the less worse ones. And from our standpoint, the impacts of a system-wide implementation of combination renewables with energy efficiency, with conservation, and reduced per capita energy use, which I think we agree on, is far less impacting on the environment than building 5,000 more nuclear reactors would be at $50 trillion just for the construction costs, which leaves you no money to do the easy, low-hanging fruit stuff.
We're getting kind of far afield from that question. Let's take another question. What's the question?
Well, I'd just like to say again,
Okay.
those studies are one book. Check check even Scientific American, get into the references. Don't trust me, don't trust him. Dig in, find out what the data is really there. How good is that study? How good is any study in this area? What are the limitations of the study? How much analysis they've done? How many impacts have they really looked at? That's the kind of things you really have to ask yourself. And I'd like to say, I'd like to have no other than solar and wind power. I just don't think it's possible. I just don't see anything out there that's going to make major replacements.
All right, let's take a question on this side of the room again. Yes, ma'am?
I think the proposition stated in the future. And 25 years to me, I'm 7 years old, is the future. So what I'm asking you, Baldwin,
It's always this way.
for those of us who would like very much to see a renewable energy 100%, do we not, do you want to tear down the nuclear plants that are there now? Do we not feel secure enough in the nuclear production of energy to keep them in place until we reach the position that we would like to be in?
Yes, I'm glad you're focusing in on the future. Let's take that 25-year span that you mentioned. My organization is not saying turn them off overnight, pull the plug immediately, unless there's an egregious safety concern that's associated with that. But responsible researchers like Dr. Makajani, who I referenced a moment ago, say you make a planned transition. So the first part of your question is, do we shut them down? Well, you gradually phase them out, okay? They have a finite operating license to begin with. It's initially 40 years, and you can get a 20-year extension. As you have heard in the news, Exelon Corporation is deciding itself, totally apart from the technological aspects, to close down reactors because they are not economic for the company. And it's because they can't compete in this market with natural gas and with the rise of renewables. Now, here's another aspect of nuclear power that we don't get into, and that's a political thing, where you have 3 pieces of legislation before the state legislature now. One piece of legislation says we need to ramp up the implementation of renewables so we get in Illinois to 35% production by the year 2030. Now it's a planned incremental addition of viable renewable energy resources over time. Over the same time, Exelon is going to be deciding, should we keep Byron open? Should we keep Quad Cities open? Should we keep Clinton open? The marketplace is actually going to decide that much more, we hope, than any other catastrophic accident might, although that is not without a possibility. So you see, it's a planned situation. And again, the reactors are retiring on their own. I would reference outside of the area, though. The largest utility in Germany, called E.ON, E.ON, made an announcement, here it is, last December, that they are going to take direct action to phase out fossil fuel and nuclear in their company. and create a separate division of the company which will be devoted to energy efficiency, increased renewable energy, and energy services. So there's going to be a split in the company. Now I bring this up because it's 5 times bigger than Exelon. It has 60,000 employees, and they have publicly made the decision to get off of nuclear power and move into a different energy direction. This is just one example out there of many other decisions by investors and by utilities.
We need to take a rebuttal.
Okay.
Yeah, can I just, so we agree on a lot of things. We agree on the importance of reducing our energy usage. We agree on the importance of increasing what we call renewables. But where we disagree on is that my colleague said we should phase out nuclear and fossil fuels. I say we should phase out fossil fuels. We've got to stop these coal power stations. They're polluting, they're dangerous, they're causing greenhouse gas emissions. But I really advise you to not be emotional about things and try not to be emotional, but look at the numbers. Because solar is between 1 and 2% now of our energy usage. You cannot turn that into 40 or 50% of our energy usage in 10, 20 years. It's just, it doesn't make sense. And by the way, you can't produce all these solar cells without using electricity, okay? Because the silicon in them comes from foundries and so on. So don't think that electricity is free. You have to use power, you have to use energy to make these devices, to make the windmills, to make these. But about emotions, I'll actually just make one comment here, because you see this so much. I mentioned these cooling towers with the water vapor coming up. There's news this week, you know, thanks radiation from Fukushima, 40 years after disaster, 4 years after disaster, radiation from the meltdowns arrived in North America. Right, okay, you can detect it, but the level is such that if you swim in off Vancouver Island every day for a year, you get 1,000th the radiation dose you get from a dental x-ray. I mean, you know, so that's not quantitative, it's playing to the emotions. When you see that solar power should grow, and it should grow, but look how small it is now, and how it has to increase to take a bite out of other sources. Go down with take coal out, don't take nuclear out.
I'll give you 1 minute.
Thank you, that's all okay.
I have to remind you that whatever has already happened must therefore be possible, because I have 3 papers on China as an example of what's going on in comparing just wind alone with nuclear power. And last year, China's wind farms reached a capacity of 115,000 megawatts compared to just 20,000 megawatts from its nuclear sector. So just in installed capacity alone, China has installed, 6 times as much energy capacity in wind alone, not even solar, as it has in nuclear. Its expansion plans call for at least twice as much, if not 3 times as much electricity coming from wind alone than they are talking about in their nuclear sector. It's already happened, folks. Nuclear is being tamped down, phased out, just because, again, not because of emotionality, but because of the numbers. The numbers indicate that, the renewables are ascending, nuclear is flatlining.
All right, thank you. All right, let's see, I think we have to go back to this, or no, this side. That was Paul who asked that, right? No. Studies. Oh, that was you, Bob. Okay, so we'll go back to this side. Yes, sir.
This is for Bob and Mike. Dave mentioned the full process of mining uranium and all the dangers that come from that and so forth. So he was looking at the total system and the impact that's happening right now. I didn't hear anything from your side about the total system of non-nuclear energy sources and what's happening right now. And I'm wondering, if you put them in a bucket, which one is worse? That's because it may be common knowledge, it may not, but non-nuclear sources of energy also require extraction and so forth.
Yeah, a lot of, anytime you have to mine something, it's dangerous. A lot of the history in the United States on nuclear weapons, essentially where you get a bad name, is essentially done during the war. They did a lot of strange things. And a lot of those materials are out there stored in tanks and sitting on sites and stuff, and was part of the war effort from World War II. Now, things are a lot more controlled. A lot of uranium actually comes from Australia and from Canada at this point. But you do have to dig a lot up. You do have to maintain the ponds. Coal miners die fairly regularly. They're in the news. There's a lot of, the reason they don't have sludge ponds is they dump it all in the air. And so again, I just come back to the fact that, actually believe it or not, there's, in a lot of cases, there's more uranium in the burnt coal emissions than there comes from a nuclear power plant. So essentially, none of these sources are perfect. They all have to be understood. They all have to be regulated. And essentially, I'd just like to remark, in China, China's going big in nuclear. They've actually stolen the Westinghouse design, their AP1000. They invited them over to build a couple, then they helped them, and then finally they said, we don't need you anymore. So they're actually moving quite dramatically. They're building a coal plant a week or something over there. It's just horrendous, but they recognize they have these huge problems, and they're likely to go more and more. Their power requirements are just going to be huge with their population.
All right.
But each of those have impacts.
Dave, you want to respond?
No.
No? Okay. Let's take a question from this side. Yes, sir.
I agree with a lot of Dave's points, but one thing I want to take issue with is the storage of electrical energy. It's not going to happen. Just like fission is not going to happen tomorrow. The ability to store large amounts of electricity is just not on the horizon at all. And battery technology is something that might be better for a car. They might improve that somewhat, but the carbon footprint, the manufacture of the batteries, and the scale that you need to store commercial amounts of electricity are absolutely prohibited. So we're never going to store electricity. Forget that. So what happens with renewables is when the wind blows and the sun shines, you can turn down your coal-fired plant or your nuclear plant, which is good. So it's worth increasing those renewables, but you're not going to be able to store the electricity.
Is there a question that you have?
I just want to take issue with the storage.
Okay.
Well, I guess I would have to disagree again because whatever has already happened is therefore possible. Outside of Chicago right now are 3 battery storage stations of 60 megawatts. Now they're not there to produce power all the time. Let me clear 2 things. We are not necessarily in favor of battery storage, okay? But that's not the only way you store electricity. So that's the first mistake that people make is, oh, we're only talking batteries here. We're not. There are lots of ways to store electrons and electricity itself, electric potential. Batteries are very polluting, and that's why we're not necessarily saying we need batteries at all. My point was that Musk, when he made his announcement last week, was talking about a utility scale battery pack, in addition to the home pack, which you referenced at $3,500. I think it was Bob said that. And there's a handout back there you can look at. So what I'm driving at here is it's already being done. It's not a question of it can't be done. It's already being done. Now the other ways you can store electricity are pumped hydro, where when costs are low, you use an electrical system, pump water uphill. When the electric is needed more or the price is different, you release a dam and it flows. So pumped hydro is one.
Efficiency is something like that?
You lose efficiency, there's no doubt. But again, we're talking about very selective uses of electricity, not the 24/7 thing that we're talking about. We're talking about when you have constraints, when you have heat waves, when you have, what do they call it, polar vortexes, where you can store it and then use it when it's needed. So the last thing that really baffles me is people talk about, well, you know, we need fossil fuel to back up solar because the sun isn't out every 24 hours, or we need it to back up wind because the wind doesn't always blow. True. So how about instead of pairing it to fossil fuels, you match wind and solar? Because there is wind at night and there is solar during the day. Now, I'm not a rocket scientist, but it seems intuitively obvious that we're just pairing the wrong energy resources and making systems that are dysfunctional. I'm saying let's examine this again and get different mixes to meet different needs.
I agree with that point.
Let's
Okay.
go ahead. Let's have a rebuttal, and then we'll probably have time for one more question after that.
Essentially, the reason they mention batteries is in Illinois it's kind of hard to pump anything uphill. There really aren't any hills. You're talking flywheels, you're talking some fairly limited processes to store electricity. You really have any trick. What's going to happen in the United States is for every coal-fired plant is shut down, you're going to have a gas plant set up. That's where they're moving. Gas is cheap. You're going to have fractured gas that's going to be used for them. That's really where you're headed. And I actually have the article here that we talk about on the batteries. Tesla's a device which will cost $3,500. Will go on sale in the United States and later this year in other countries. The initial price of this battery could discourage widespread adoption, especially for a product that may only have limited use. You're really talking gigawatts. You're talking potentially days of storage of gigawatts. It's got to be looked at in some level of detail. It's not simple enough to just say, oh, here we'll just pump it up. We'll pump water uphill for a while. It's not that simple. It's much more complicated, and you really have to dig into it. When I said before there aren't incredible studies, it's because they're books that talk about a story, but there's no real analysis, there's no details in terms of impacts. How are we going to do this? How are we going to produce the windmills? How are we going to produce the solar chips and stuff? Those things just aren't there. Now, with that, I still think nuclear power is sufficiently safe. It is regulated. You have an opportunity. If you don't believe it's regulated properly, environmental impact statements are there. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission has a process you can get involved into. There's a lot of ways to make your voices heard. Talk to your legislators if you think it's not safe enough. Get them to propose legislation for it. So the society as a whole has to make that determination, and as part of that, nuclear power has, at least at this, a much more robust say in terms of what people think and regulations. You can measure radiation. You can figure out how much is there. You can start to determine how much you're going to release and whether that's safe.
Thank you, Bob. So let's take another question, just a practical check for a moment. Mike, you said you had to leave. You have a hard stop.
10:40.
At what?
A limo at 10:40.
A limo at 10:40. Okay. So we'll take one more question and then a rebuttal, and then we'll have a couple minutes for a closing statement. Mike, you might not be able to stay for the results, but we'll let you know what the tally is at the end. So,
could he make his closing statement before he leaves?
I'm sorry, what?
Could he make a closing statement before he leaves?
Yeah. Give it to me.
Yeah. Last question, yes, sir.
Speaking to, I guess, the question of safety, how would you respond to the Forbes article that's talking about the number of deaths per million terawatt hours, I believe it is, caused by, say, coal, and ranking all of them. Coal is like 170,000 deaths per terawatt hour, or million terawatt hours. And I think at the bottom end was nuclear at 90, and that's including Fukushima and Chernobyl. Half of this debate is safety. I think that kind of slam dunks safety, doesn't it? This is to the anti-side.
Right. Go ahead, Dave.
Well, I'm not sure what the source of the Chernobyl data was, but depending on who you talk to, if you take the traditional IAEA response that only 55 people died at Chernobyl, which is absolute nonsense because 5 years later, the president of the Ukraine said that the figure of 35,000 was not too unrealistic. And the fact that the qualitative difference between nuclear-related accidents and what people perceive of it, if you don't drop dead instantly, like with insecticide, it doesn't count. But if you have to examine into the future and extrapolate out, you get some different numbers. Now, on the 20th anniversary of Chernobyl, there were two conferences taking place across the street from each other in Kiev. I was at one of them. The government sponsored the one across the street. And there they were talking about, well, yes, 4,000 thyroid-related deaths. Isn't that terrible? But you can treat thyroid conditions. Whereas at the conference that we were at, we had doctors who were actually treating people in Western Ukraine, in Western Russia, and certainly in Belarus, who were saying the reality in the field is a lot different than what the epidemiological extrapolations indicate. What I'm driving at here is, again, dig at the numbers a little bit, because everything is a GIGO, everything is a black box that you got to examine the assumptions. And I think the jury is really out still, even on the Chernobyl disaster.
I think that you're misinterpreting what I'm saying. Okay. You're speaking in terms of absolute numbers of deaths. The study that was listed was speaking in terms of millions of gigawatt hours produced. For
electricity produced.
So for a given amount of electricity produced, even if it were, say, 4,000 or 40,000, they were counting the ongoing cancer deaths and whatnot. Even if it were that much, the energy density of nuclear is such that for producing an amount of power, there are many, many more fewer deaths than even wind, solar, and hydro have higher death rates.
Well, I can't speak to it because I'm not familiar with the numbers and the sources that you're coming from on that. But I guess I have a question.
Let's have a rebuttal, and then we'll have a couple minutes.
Sort of a closing statement,
Yeah, go right ahead.
Also, because in quite right. Coal has produced enormous numbers of deaths, way more. And it continues to do so. People, and you know, I don't want to get sort of hand waving about this. As we always say, look into the numbers and realize actual quantitative things. We agree that we should reduce our energy consumption, higher efficiency. You know, LED lights are much more efficient. Lighting is not as bad as using up as much as air conditioning. Don't be so cautious on it. But reducing consumption and increase renewables, absolutely. But what I'm insisting is, please do not decrease nuclear. Do not use them to decrease nuclear, but to decrease coal and oil power stations. Okay, these are the elephants in the room. These are dangerous and polluting and causing global climate change, which is going to be, is continuing to get more and more serious. Okay, so that's what I'm saying. Yeah, we should use the increase in renewables, but they're so small now that they're not going to dominate the landscape. Even in some little places, maybe they do. Denmark's okay, an example, but I don't think even wind power is providing most of the electricity in Denmark. But so anyway, that's my closing statement. So I think it is a necessary part. You can't just turn it off. You shouldn't even phase it out. We should phase out fossil fuels. Thank you.
Right, Dave, you want to make that closing statement? Yeah, and then after his closing statement, or while he's making his closing statement, I give you a piece of paper. Please tear off the one word that indicates your opinion at the end of this debate, and we'll do a quick tally. Maybe we'll adjourn into the other room for the vote count. Looks like the kids need to practice their instruments. Go ahead, Dave.
Thank you. We would respectfully disagree with the conclusion that nuclear needs to go forward. It's a 19th century technology using a 20th century heat source operating in the 21st century. It relies on water, which will be a critical resource in a climate-disrupted world. It relies on exotic means of containing radiation. It's prone to low probability but very high consequence accidents. We think that's a road we do not need to travel on anymore. We've learned enough about it. That's the conclusion we've reached. Yes, there are problems with any energy resource. As I said, we're not here to champion anything in particular. The second law of thermodynamics governs everything we're talking about here. But the point is that on the broad scale of things, we are and we have to move to a renewable energy future in terms of the relative hazards and the positive benefits that can be gained by doing renewables. And I would leave you with a quote by a former NRC Commissioner, Peter Bradford, who, he's been in the trenches. He worked for the NRC as one of the 5 commissioners. He was the Public Services Director for the state of New York. And he said that, the problem with nuclear, think of it this way. We don't fight world hunger using caviar, no matter how nutritious fish eggs are. And in the same way, you don't boil water to get electrons using an exotic energy resource that on a bad day can wipe out the entire positive benefit of a whole industry, as it has happened at Chernobyl. We don't need that anymore, and we can't afford it anymore.
Yeah.
Nuclear is too expensive, takes too long to construct, has too many liabilities, and when there are so many other positive choices we can make, which are locally beneficial as well as beneficial in an energy system, we think it's a no-brainer that we need to go to reducing per capita energy, using energy efficiency and conservation, and getting our power from renewable, decentralized sources that are locally controlled.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you for the We're going to have the vote count next door in the room. If you're interested in the tally, we can adjourn in there. We also can ask for the questions.
Yeah, I still don't understand if you agree, if you're against nuclear, that you disagree.
That's right. Agree is for nuclear,
Okay,
disagree is
that's just, to me, if we go either, and get my money questions. So I have to give my opinion.